Well, there are many people to thank. First of all, I'd like to thank Arhat for her very kind and overly flattering introduction. I would also like to thank Professor Meir Shahar for all his hard work in organizing this. And I know all of us are very grateful to the Confucius Institute and the Department of East Asian Studies for their sponsorship and great contributions to making this day possible. At the outset, I'd like to also thank the unexpectedly large number of you for coming on such a nice day when you could have been having coffee in a cafe outside. I hope being inside for this time won't be too much of a burden for all of you. There's a handout coming around. Does everybody have this by now? Okay.
So you can share them if they're not enough, maybe. Not enough.
Are there more up here, Arhat?
No.
Oh, only those two. Okay. You can. No, I didn't get the original.
But if you can share, maybe, please.
Okay. Okay. The topic that I'd like to discuss this morning is the stages of the Bodhisattva path. That is, the stages of the path of spiritual self-cultivation that leads ultimately to becoming a Buddha. These stages are generally referred to as Bhumi. There are 10 of these Bhumi, a term in Sanskrit which literally means earth or ground. This is the first item on the handout. But is used in practice to refer to levels of spiritual accomplishment, beginning with the lowest level, the first Bhumi, and culminating in the 10th Bhumi, at which point one then attains complete Buddhahood. The fact that many Mahayana scriptures, not all of them, as we'll see, but many Mahayana scriptures, talk about a system of 10 such stages, of 10 bhumis leading to becoming a Buddha, implies that Buddhist practice in the Mahayana consists of a gradual path with discrete signposts, discrete, we might say, symptoms, to borrow medical terminology, of accomplishment along the way. The opposite of this, of course, is an all-at-once or sudden awakening model. Not step by step, but suddenly attaining Buddhahood. And here we might point to the fact that this is not this distinction between gradual and sudden is not by any means unique to Buddhism. I'd just point briefly to Karl Popper's well-known book, Presuppositions of India's Philosophies, where he distinguishes between progress philosophy, in other words, step-by-step self-improvement and accomplishment, versus a leap philosophy, in which one goes from step one to the end all at once. Indian Buddhism is not completely homogeneous in this respect. It doesn't speak with one voice. But to talk about it in terms of its majority stance, Indian Buddhism is a profoundly gradualistic tradition. Not only does it assume that spiritual development is the result of step-by-step self-cultivation, it assumes that this takes place over an uncountable number of lifetimes. Not all in one life, not all at one moment, but gradually over eons and eons of time. I'm sure many of you from your previous study of various forms of Buddhism are familiar with this scenario. But you may not have heard that there is even a passage in the canonical sutra literature of the Theravada school, that is transmitted in the Pali language, that explicitly affirms this gradualist model and criticizes and sets aside the sudden one. This is taken from the Pali Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 7. The reference is on your handout for those who'd like to go and check this later. make sure I'm not inventing references in this talk. The passage goes as follows. Monks, that is, bhikkhus in Pali, I do not say that final knowledge, the word is anya, final knowledge, is achieved all at once. And this anya is a synonym equivalent to attaining arhatship, or final nirvana. So the Buddha says, monks, I do not say that final knowledge is achieved all at once. On the contrary, final knowledge is achieved by gradual training, by gradual practice, by gradual progress. Now, this is just one passage, but this is a passage that I think is particularly interesting in that it makes explicit what is implicit throughout virtually all of Indian Buddhist literature, with some very interesting and important exceptions, which perhaps will be mentioned by other speakers, perhaps not. What this implies, in turn, is that even in pre-Mahayana literature, that is, literature that doesn't say anything about 10 bhumis leading to Buddhahood, we find discussions of discrete stages of spiritual progress. And I've just listed on the handout 4 such stages, the standard ones in non-Mahayana Buddhist traditions. With the highest one, the final stage, being the Arhat, literally worthy one, who has attained final and complete nirvana. At lower stages, there are a total of 4 of these. The penultimate one, before arhatship, is the anagamin, the non-returner. Someone who is so close to arhatship when they die in this world that they'll never come back. And yet they're not an arhat quite yet. And so these unusual beings are born in one of the upper levels of Buddhist heavens, where they make that final step into arhatship, never returning to this human realm again. And so they're called non-returners. The lower stage than that is the Sakradagaman, the one who comes back just once, has only one more lifetime in this world as a human being before attaining nirvana or arhatship. And the lowest of these 4 accomplished beings is the Shrotapana, the one who has entered the stream. An interesting category, which I'll try to remember to refer to again later. The Shrotapana, the stream enterer, is one who has begun to get it, who has begun to understand and have insight into the realities of the world as it is, the universe as it is. And because of that breakthrough to insight, this being, and all of these, I should add, all these 4 can be male or female, the Shrotapana, woman or man, will be born only a maximum of 7 more times before attaining final nirvana. Could be fewer if they work hard and have good karma from the past. But at most, they will experience 7 more lives as a human being before attaining the goal of arhatship. Below these 4 is a character known as the Pratubjana. Edward Konza, in his many translations, used to like to translate this as foolish common beings, was it, or foolish ordinary beings, unenlightened, everyday people who have made no perceptible spiritual progress. So all 4 of the stages in Buddhism are stages of people who are already on their way to awakening. So the idea of spiritual stages is already there long before the Mahayana, the so-called great vehicle or greater vehicle, comes onto the scene. So what I'd like to deal with this morning is the question of where does the idea of 10 Bodhisattva Bhumis, the stages of the path, come from? We can see that the structure of stages of the path is already there, centuries before. And for those of you who are not at all specialists in Buddhism or in the Mahayana in particular, let me just throw in here a line or 2 of current scholarly thinking on history. The Theravada materials, the Pali Canon as we have it, is one set of Buddhist scriptures, much of which, but not all of which, probably goes back to the lifetime of the Buddha himself. Some of it is later layers. The Mahayana scriptures, by contrast, all are thought to date from several centuries after the death of Shakyamuni Buddha. So they are, we could say, an update in Buddhist thinking in India. Newer ways of presenting what it is that Shakyamuni Buddha meant. Most scholars these days would say that the earliest Mahayana sutras or scriptures probably date from around the 1st century BCE, maybe a little bit earlier, and continued to be composed for several centuries. So one of the great games in Mahayana Buddhist studies is pin the date on the sutra. How old is this text? And there are many interesting differences of opinion on particular ones. I will reflect a little bit on problems and challenges of chronology today. So overall, I'm going to be dealing today with the question of where do the 10 Bhumis come from? Where does this idea emerge? How was it first understood? And a little bit on how was it developed later on. But I might begin by backing up and saying, before we talk about Bodhisattva stages, where does the idea of the Bodhisattva come from? Where did Indian Buddhists get the idea that nirvana was not enough? That's a strange concept. That becoming an Arhat, attaining complete insight into how reality really is, and full release from craving and from future rebirths is not enough? This is really what the Mahayana is talking about. That at least some people should aim for something higher. That is, aim for the accomplishment of full Buddhahood instead. Now, an obvious question is, what's the difference between an Arhat and a Buddha? And there are as many answers to that, probably, as there are Buddhists to whom you would ask that question. But let me give you the lowest common denominator, the most basic difference between the two in early Indian Buddhism. That is, an Arhat is someone who attains nirvana by following a textbook, so to speak, that is following the teachings that have already been produced by an awakened Buddha. A Buddha, on the other hand, is someone who may have teachers, may have tutors of various sorts in meditation or yoga or other practices, but who has no teacher who is fully awakened to the complete nature of reality as it is. A Buddha, in other words, is someone who figures it out for himself and then teaches it to others. And Shakyamuni Buddha is said to be such a person. He did have some gurus, teachers he studied with, but none were fully awakened to the ultimate truth and reality. So he discovered it, he figured it out, and then, having gone down this path himself, made it far easier for others to subsequently follow in his footsteps and attain nirvana much more quickly than they would have done without his guidance. The problem is, after Shakyamuni Buddha is gone, what happens then? And Buddhists, I think in a very interesting kind of consistency, have said that all compounded things, that is, all things that result from causes and effects, are temporary, they're transitory. Buddhism, they say, is one of those things. Not the truths that Buddhism teaches, but Buddhism as an institution, Buddhism as a lineage of teachers, as a collection of sacred texts. All of these, they say, are temporary, and they'll eventually die out. They'll eventually be lost. And Indian Buddhists proposed a variety of different time spans for how long Buddhism would last, starting with 500 years, expanding to up to 5,000 years or slightly more in the Indian Buddhist traditions, and in East Asia, going way beyond that to 10,000 years and more, all of which is detailed in many Buddhist scriptures. So the corollary then is that Buddhism, as we know it, is eventually going to disappear. And then the world will be without any guide, without any guidance on how to attain nirvana, how to attain full awakening to reality. So what's essential is that sometime in the future there be another Buddha, like Shakyamuni, who in this now Buddhism-free zone, or Buddha-free zone, will figure it out for himself and teach it again to others in the distant future. And as many of you know, Maitreya is considered to be the next such being who is expected to come along. There will be others in the future, and what a bodhisattva is a volunteer for the extremely long and demanding training process that is said to lead to the attainment of full Buddhahood. Some of you may have noticed I used the pronoun he to talk about a person who becomes a Buddha. Buddhists have almost universally said, and in Indian Buddhism, virtually 100%, very small tantric exceptions, maybe others that some of you know, have said that only men can be Buddhas. Women can attain arhatship, no problem. There are dozens, maybe hundreds of them mentioned in the Pali texts. But a Buddha is thought to be exclusively male, generally speaking. If some of you want to discuss why that is, we can do that in the question period. The assumption is not that women can't be bodhisattvas, although at the beginning it seems that those who formulated ideas about the path were thinking of male bodhisattvas only. Later it comes to be understood that women also can begin the path. But if any of us really want to be Buddhas, we have to turn into men. At some point, in some future life, prior to attaining Buddhahood, a female bodhisattva must be reborn as a male. Those of you who are specialists in East Asia may find this a little strange. If you're thinking about Buddha nature traditions or other talk about women and Buddhahood in some East Asian or Indian tantric or Tibetan tantric connections. As I say, there are exceptions and very important ones. But in India, generally speaking, part of moving toward becoming a Buddha is giving up femaleness and becoming a male. As I say, that's not my main topic today, so that's all I'm going to say about it at the moment. But I'd be happy to take questions on that if some of you want to bring those up. So where does the idea of how to become a bodhisattva come from? Well, the next item on your handout is my very quick response to that question. It comes, so it seems, from Jataka tales. Jataka tales, we could call them literally stories about births. What kind of birth? Past lives, past births of the being who eventually became Shakyamuni Buddha. There are hundreds of these, known in India, East Asia, Tibet, and elsewhere, Southeast Asia. And they describe past lifetimes of the future Shakyamuni. In many of these, he was a crafty animal, or a compassionate prince, or any number of other roles. No female roles, by the way, in the Pali Canon, but there are women, former births of Shakyamuni in other Buddhist traditions. So this may be a Theravada thing. None of the Bodhisattva stories be about women. In any event, it seems very clear that Buddhists eventually began to think about the future when there would be no Buddhism and no Buddha in this world. And to think about how a few volunteers, as I call them in my book, a few good men, using the United States Marine Corps recruiting slogan. We don't need everybody, but we need a few good men to become Buddhas in the future and to embark on, to start out on this very difficult bodhisattva path. What did these early bodhisattvas do? They seem to have read and studied the Jataka stories. In other words, how did he do it? How did Shakyamuni become a Buddha? If we do everything he did, won't we become Buddhas too? In other words, the Jataka tales, which began as, you could say, hagiography, a description of the greatness of Shakyamuni Buddha and how he became what he was, later came to be used as a textbook, a how to do it yourself manual for how to become a Buddha. Now, there are two things we don't see in these Jataka tales. We don't see them associated explicitly with the 6 perfections or paramitas of Mahayana Buddhism. I think I didn't put that on here. The word paramita is a few lines down in the title Ashta Sahasrika Prajna Paramita. There's a group of 6 of these perfections, 6 of these extreme virtues ranging from giving, donation, renunciation of one's goods and even body, to wisdom, prajna, that are to be cultivated by a bodhisattva. And in Indian Jataka tale collections, we might see examples of giving or examples of wisdom, but they're not arranged according to these 6 perfections. In fact, they're not really arranged at all. They're just a rather hodgepodge mixture of many different stories of past lives of the Buddha. So first, they lack any explicit connection with a list of 6 perfections. I realize there's a list of paramis in the Theravada. Those are thought to be later. Again, if anyone wants to talk about those, feel free to bring that up. The second thing that they lack is any clear discussion of stages, of levels of progress toward Buddhahood. Does being a rabbit come before or after being a deer? Well, there are traditions about which are the last lifetimes of the Buddha, or the Bodhisattva, I should say, prior to becoming a Buddha. But there's no clear progression of spiritual development in these stories. Those are things that were still to be developed in Mahayana Sutra literature. So, if we want to look for the beginnings of Mahayana Sutra literature, and therefore for the first discussions of the 10 Bodhisattva stages, or Bhumis, how do we do that? I've already alluded to the difficulty of deciding which Mahayana scriptures are the oldest. Everybody in this field has their favorites. I like this one. I like that one. Sometimes we say that whatever sutra a scholar likes, that scholar says it's early. If it's early, it's foundational, it's more genuine, it's more wonderful. And so there's some room to joke about reasons why different people said things were early or late. But are there any objective criteria by which a scholar might actually say, on these grounds, not just that I like this sutra, and it sounds like the Buddha to me, are there any objective grounds for saying Sutra A is earlier than Sutra B? There are, and there are really 2 kinds that I'm going to mention briefly today. The first is a very difficult one, but essential. That is what we could call internal grounds. Within a given scripture itself, what are the composers assuming as background? In other words, if we read, for example, let's take the title here, Ashta Sahasrita Prajna Paramita. What do its authors already assume as background? In other words, what's already happened by the time that text was composed? What do they seem not to know about at all? Can we place sutras along a continuum of time based on what they assume has already gone before? We can, with great difficulty, and this is what I would call using internal criteria to establish a kind of textual praticca samutpada, or textual dependent origination. What already has to have happened for this scripture to make sense? What I'm going to use this morning, though, is a different kind of evidence, informed by that one, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. And that is, I'm going to talk about the external evidence provided by Chinese translations. That may seem very strange. But in India, Buddhist scriptures generally have no dates at all on them. Not even on the copies until fairly late, when you get occasionally a colophon with a precise date. By fairly late, I mean 8th, 9th, 10th century at the earliest for most of the dated versions of these. So we have anonymous scriptures called Mahayana Sutras attributed to Shakyamuni Buddha. These are, in other words, pseudepigrapha, according to one of the terms used in biblical studies. It says it's by Shakyamuni, but in fact, it's the product of a later time, but attributed to this great thinker, kind of re-expressing his thought. So why use Chinese translations? Chinese culture is a profoundly history-oriented culture. You could say that in China, history is scripture. And certainly it's a type of classic in Chinese literature. History writing is something from which we can learn extremely important, some would say ultimately important, values and truths. Not surprisingly, in many cases, though less than we would hope, the Chinese recorded the dates when specific Indian texts arrived in China and were translated. So by using the identity and the dates of the translators, we can put the translations in chronological order, in order of their composition in China, their production as translations. Is this the same as the order in which they were produced or composed in India? Absolutely not, unfortunately. Texts came to China in a much different sequence than the sequence in which they were composed in India. So we have to use this external evidence with great caution. But what it does provide to us is a terminus ante quem, a stopping point at which we can say, by the time of the translation into Chinese, we can at least say this sutra existed in India. That much we can say. Had it existed for 10 years or 300 is a different question. But it gives us at least a basic framework in which to operate. So what I'd like to do this morning is to talk about representations of the stages of the Bodhisattva path in the earliest available Chinese translations. That is to say, the earliest available Mahayana scripture translations. I'm going to skip over the extremely important works of Anshu Gao, a Parthian missionary and Buddhist translator from the middle of the 2nd century, who produced texts that are not Mahayana in content. So I'm going to be going to what we call the 2nd generation of translators in China, from the late 2nd century of the Common Era. Around, we can give a ballpark figure for the start of this, around the year 180 of the Common Era. It's where I'll be starting today. And then we can look in these translations and see what do they tell us about the stages of the Bodhisattva path. What do they say most specifically about the 10 Bhumis? But more broadly, what do they say about Bodhisattva progress, Bodhisattva stages as a whole? The first translator that we need to look at, if we do this, is Lokakshema, that's a reconstructed Indian name, Lokakshema. The Chinese characters are given here for those who are aficionados of Chinese. And in case you're wondering, the thing I skipped over here right above it, the Yuduji Jing, the compendium on the 6 paramitas, that word du is an abbreviation for duwuji, a translation of paramita into Chinese. This is a Chinese collection of Jataka tales, which does use the 6 paramitas as its organizing principle. We don't see this, in other words, in Indian Buddhist texts, where all the 6 paramitas structure Jataka tales. But this Jataka tale collection is organized that way. The jury is still out. That is, scholars do not yet agree on whether this structure, this organization, was produced in China. The stories themselves are Indian. But is the table of contents Indian? Or is it a Chinese creation? That's still to be determined. So for those who are interested in Jatakas and interested in China, I highly recommend this very interesting text. It dates from the latter half of the 3rd century. So go take a look if you're interested. And there's a French translation, so very convenient if you want to get a little help in practicing this kind of Buddhist Chinese. Okay, back to Lokakshema after that brief detour. What do we see about the Bodhisattva path in the earliest translations produced by Lokakshema? For the most part, we do not see the 10 Bhumis at all. The first 2 texts, something's out of line here, but I'll repair that here quickly. The first 2 texts by him that I'd like to mention are his version of the Ashtasahasrika Prajna Paramita. If you didn't choose Sanskrit, you'll know why with these long names. The Chinese name is in parentheses here. The Taisho text number is 224. He is also the translator of the Akshobhya Vyuha, which is a couple of lines down, again with the Chinese name in parentheses. On that one, there's a little uncertainty of whether it's really him or a later member of his community, but it's part of his lineage that text comes from. So that means these two sutras date from roughly the 180 of the Common Era into perhaps the early 200s in their Chinese translations. What do they say about the 10 Bodhisattva Bhumis? Nothing. Never mentioned at all. The word Bhumi does appear in the Ashtasahasrika, and a translation of it appears in the Chinese version, but it's not used to refer to bodhisattva stages. It's used to refer to types of practitioners. The Shravaka, the auditor or listener, who is training to become an Arhat. So you hear about a Shravaka Bhumi, the level of the Shravaka. You hear about a Pratyeka Buddha Bhumi. Pratyeka Buddhas being very shadowy figures, often not clear how many Buddhists, if any, were really thinking that they might become such a thing. I'm looking forward to perhaps hearing this afternoon a little more about that from one of our speakers. But the Pratyeka Buddha Bhumi is treated as another level. And the highest level of practitioner is the Bodhisattva Bhumi, the Bodhisattva level. In other words, these terms are used very differently in the Ashtasasrika. This is the 8,000 line or smaller perfection of wisdom, if you've seen it in English translation. So they talk about Bhumis, but they talk about them not in terms of progress on any particular track, but the track itself. So you might say, this person is in an MA track, or this person is in a PhD track. But they're not talking about progress within those tracks. They're separate lanes on the highway of Buddhist practice, so to speak. The same is true in the Akshobhya Vyuha. No reference to 10 Bhumis whatsoever. Do these texts then say anything at all about levels of bodhisattva practice? They do. And I would call them, in sort of joking, tongue-in-cheek fashion, 2 Bhumi sutras. Sutras that have 2 stages. This is not using the word Bhumi in the way these sutras actually use it, but this is my own way of talking about them. They do refer to 2 levels. Very simple, very straightforward. The more advanced level is the Buddhist who is, in Edward Conze's inimitable English, irreversible, not capable of falling back. In Sanskrit, it's avaivartika or avinivartaniya. Such a person has made so much progress toward Buddhahood that he, or perhaps she, it's now beginning to be said, cannot fall back. It doesn't mean they're going to become a Buddha tomorrow, or even quickly. There are many lifetimes, sometimes billions of lifetimes, it would seem, from the numbers of eons that are described. Many lifetimes still before becoming a Buddha. But once they reach that point of being not falling back or non-backsliding, they are considered to be on the home stretch. They absolutely will become a Buddha at some time in the near or distant future. So the non-backsliding, or avagartika group, is the more advanced level in these scriptures. What's the lower level? Everybody else. All other bodhisattvas. And there's no technical term for it. There's no, Edward Conze uses this term irreversible, which I think isn't all that bad, but a lot of people call that Buddhist hybrid English and criticize it as a very strange term. If these bodhisattvas, who are the highly developed, are irreversible, to borrow, again, Conze's term, then the lower ones are reversible. The texts don't call them that. But they can fall back. They can get confused. They can even give up and fall down to the Shravaka Bhumi. This is the language used in these scriptures. If a bodhisattva makes big mistakes, really screws up on the path, They fall to the level of the Shravaka. And if they're really unlucky, they become an Arhat. Can you imagine? They attain nirvana. What a disaster. But that's what the texts say. This is ironic when you consider the fact that these bodhisattvas are training to become a Buddha. And what does a Buddha do? He helps people attain arhatship. That's his job description. A Buddha in these early Mahayana scriptures is there to help other people become arhats. So what's so bad about falling to the level of the Shravaka and becoming an arhat? Well, the analogy I like to use for this is it's as if you had a hard-working but very discouraged PhD candidate who's been working and working toward the goal, and one day comes into her advisor or his advisor and says, I just can't make it. I don't have what it takes. I'm going to give up and take a terminal MA degree. I can't do the PhD. It's too much for me. The advisor, who believes in the student's capability, would say, you want a terminal MA? What a terrible thing. Why should you fall to that level? Somebody like you. And the advisor might say very bad things about a master's degree. But the advisor is not going to say that to MA students. A master's degree is wonderful. Strive on and get it. But to the PhD student who's ready to give up, that same advisor might say very negative things about taking an MA and walking out. Whereas that advisor would celebrate the graduation day of an MA candidate who is set out to attain an MA. In other words, these negative things about falling to the level of the Shravaka are insider discourse. Bodhisattva advisor to Bodhisattva student. Don't give up. Stick it out. Don't become a lousy Shravaka. Later, as many of you know, the language of lousy Shravaka accelerates and becomes even more obnoxious, and you start hearing about those Hinayanists, those who are on the low or crummy vehicle. The Tibetans translate it very well as low vehicle. The Chinese were trying to be nice. Small vehicle, compact car. This it is not. Hinayana means lousy, crummy, poor, low vehicle. So, I again won't have time to go into that in detail. My point here is simply that in early Mahayana scriptures, and these texts, by the way, are early also on internal grounds, relatively early, we don't see anything more than two stages for the Bodhisattva. And I'll continue to use this funny language, reversible and irreversible. The one who's on the home stretch is unrelapsing, irreversible. The one who still could fall back, could mess up, is reversible. Another text translated at about the same time by Anchuan and Nyenpo Tiao, around 180, is the Ugra Paripracha, which I've said a lot about and won't say much about today. This one also simply assumes, in rather vague terms, two stages, being reversible and irreversible. That's all. No 10 Bhumis in any of these early translations. In fact, if we look at all the scriptures translated during the Han Dynasty, that is up until about the year 220, or before, when things are falling apart and translations aren't being produced, we find reference to 10 Bodhisattva stages, a list of what these are, a discussion of how to do them, in only one text from the Han period. This is a version of the Buddha-Avatamsaka. And those of you who know the Buddha-Avatamsaka, or the Huayan Jing, or the Kegon Kyo in Japanese, will know that it's a very huge text, translated quite a bit later than this period. What I'm talking about here for the Han period is something that we could call the Proto Buddha-Avatamsaka, the earlier version of this text, before it had all the add-ons that made it into the huge Huayan Jing, or Kegon Kyo. This text, now we can say, was translated like the Ashtasahasrika and like the Akshavyuha. It was translated for the first time by Lokakshema. And I'm going to take you now to the second page of the handout, very briefly. If you look through the Chinese canon for a Buddha Avatamsaka translated by Luca in the Han period, you will not find it. It's not there. What you will find is a little text, Taisho 280, called the Dosha Jing, which talks about worlds throughout the universe, different Buddha fields, different lands, where different Buddhas are currently living and teaching. It talks about that for a while, talks about the names of these different lands. Each one has a representative bodhisattva, gives their names, and then it stops. It has no ending, no nice conclusion, none of that stuff about the audience clapped and everybody went home that you find at the end of many sutras. Nothing. It just stops. Well, it so happens that if you don't stop there, I've drawn a little picture of it as if it were a torn piece of paper. If you jump over the next text, Taisho 281, and go on to Taisho 282, you find that it has no beginning and no ending. It starts right in the middle of things. And Taisho 283, which talks about the 10 Bodhisattva Bhumis, 10 Bodhisattva stages, has no beginning, but it does have an ending. You can probably see what I'm suggesting has happened here. If you hook them together, you have a coherent narrative text consisting of 3 parts that works together as one unit. And in fact, if you look down below here in the chart, these things over on the right, 278 and 279, are the big Buddha Avatamsaka in Chinese, the Keigong-kyo or Huayan Jing. The 2 on the left, you can see what I've done with 280, 282, and 283. I've stacked them. I've lined them up, made them into a sequential narrative. And if we look back to the left, Taisho 281, it lines up with the content of that text. There's one little place where there's a difference. I've put hyphens there. But the sequence is the same. The content is the same. The wording is completely different. These are by different translators. So what appears to have happened is Lokakshema's original translation somehow got separated. It was in separate sections, separate pieces of paper or palm leaf or whatever the material came in on. At any rate, Lokakshema's version got accidentally, I think, divided. And this other 2 pieces, 282 and 283, were subsequently assigned to do. Somebody decided, oh, it must be this translator, it must be that translator. But what I'm suggesting is all 3 of these can be reconstructed as originally parts of a single text that got separated. And I have an article on this. If anybody wants to read all the gory details, I can give you the reference. But Taisho 281, if you go back to the first page, is the Pusabanya Jing, which is a 3rd century translation, still quite early, the first half of the 3rd century, which deals, again, with the Bodhisattva stages. So the earliest account, then, that we have of the 10 Bhumis in Chinese dates from the end of the 2nd century in this text, which we can now say is all by Lokakshema, and then again a second translation of it in the early 3rd century. So I want to spend the rest of my time here talking about what we see in this text. What does it have to tell us about the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva path? If we look at the Dosha Jing and its cousins, or the Pusabanya Jing, the 2 versions of this, we'll see that it deals with 3 major topics. First, as I said, it deals with the Buddha fields of the 10 directions, tells who is the Buddha in each of these, and the Bodhisattva. Second, there's a long discourse by the Bodhisattva Manjushri on how to practice Buddhism in everyday life. But third, what we have is a discussion of the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva path. And that's what I'd like to spend the rest of my time on here. If you turn to page 3, you'll find a horrifying table in Chinese, Tibetan, and Sanskrit of the names of these stages. I'm not going to talk about all of their Asian language names. These are for reference for those of you who do one or more of these languages. But I'd like to just concentrate on what they say about the path. Let's talk about what their names mean, and I'm going here mainly from the Zhiqian translation, but also referring to other versions. The first stage has to do with bringing forth a thought. What thought? If you're in Buddhist studies, you'll know exactly what thought. This is bodhicitta, the thought of the aspiration, the desire, or the willingness to become a Buddha. And it's this thought, this aspiration, that represents the beginning of the Bodhisattva path, according to most Mahayana scriptures. It then goes through a number of other stages, a controlling stage, a practicing yoga, various versions for this next one having to do with either distinguished birth or bringing forth something precious. And then perfecting one's practice, perfecting one's resolve. And look at stage 7. If you can read any one of these languages, you'll recognize that this is the stage of not being able to fall back. In this system, it's at the 7th stage that the Bodhisattva is finally certain to become a Buddha in the future. Will not fall back from the Bodhisattva path, may take a long time, but will not fall down to the Shravaka level. Let me also draw your attention to the last 3. Very interesting terms. The 8th stage, which one shall I pick here? Let's do the Sanskrit column on the right. Kumara Bhuta. What does that mean? If we did it literally, it would mean someone who has become a young man. But the way that word is actually used in Buddhist scriptures is 2 ways. One is simply young man. Implies a fellow of good family, but not just any riffraff young man. But it can also be used to mean prince. A young man of royal lineage. The 9th stage makes it rather clear that this is the context we're looking at. The 9th stage in Sanskrit, Yalva Raja. Yalva meaning youth, Raja, a derivative of Raja, king. This is a crown prince. Not just any prince, but the prince who is designated as the next king. Finally, we have a term that, and I've used the Gandavyuha here because it's extant in Sanskrit. There are other reconstructed versions of some of these terms that are a little bit different, but not significantly so. The last one, then, is Abhisheka Prapta. Someone who has received Abhisheka. What is Abhisheka? In this context, it's being anointed as the next king. In other words, we go here from someone at the beginning who brings forth the desire, the resolve to become a Buddha, to, at the end, going through stages of prince, crown prince, and designated heir, the next king. We're talking, in other words, about Buddhahood as becoming a Dharma king. Let me just note in passing, Manjushri, a certain very famous bodhisattva, is extremely important in these Proto Avatamsaka texts. And Manjushri is the bodhisattva who has as his epithet, his, not nickname, but sort of title, Kumara Bhuta. Very often you see references to Manjushri Kumara Bhuta. So these texts, this Buddhavatamsaka, appears to have been produced in an environment in which Manjushri was very important, and in which the royal symbolism that his title Kumara Bhuta represents was developed in thinking about what is it that comprises the upper levels of the path to Buddhahood. Notice once the person is irreversible, they start getting described with terminology that can only be male. A prince is not a princess. It's not the same thing. At this stage, a woman bodhisattva is supposed to have begun to be reborn only as a male. What else does the Avatamsaka do with its list of 10 stages? Well, let me mention that it gives a very coherent, very clear discussion of how to practice them. Here's what you do at stage 1, here's what you do at stage 2, and so on down the list. A person could, in other words, take this as a textbook or a manual of how to become a Buddha and use it rather effectively. But if these 10 stages are how one becomes a Buddha, how come they're not in the earlier sutras? People had memorized the earlier non-Mahayana scriptures, and the question obviously comes forth, hey, wait a minute, I've never heard this. No one in my monastery recites such a thing. Where did this idea of 10 Bhumis come from? And the sutra, interestingly, gives a very explicit answer to that. It doesn't pose it as a question and answer, but it encodes it in the narrative of the text. Where does this come from? In the section on the 10 stages, we find that there's a bodhisattva named Dharmamati, who's on your handout on page 1, if you want to go back to his name. The Chinese transcription has suffered in transmission. Some version of Tan Moati. But in any case, he's down toward the bottom of the page. It's now written as Tan Mei Mati, or Fai in translation. Where did the idea of 10 stages come from? This sutra tells us. Dharmamati had a vision. As he was sitting in meditation, he saw these Buddhas mentioned in the first part of the sutra, of the 10 directions. That is, Buddhas everywhere throughout the universe. And the Buddhas taught him what the stages of the Bodhisattva path are. In other words, he didn't learn this from Shakyamuni Buddha. He wasn't alive then, at least not under the form of Dharmamati. He didn't learn this from superiors in his monastery. It's not a transmitted oral tradition that goes back to Shakyamuni. Where did he get it? In a vision. He heard it from Buddhas in other parts of the universe. When he awoke from the vision, he told others, and eventually somebody wrote it down. They're telling us, in other words, that the whole idea of 10 Bodhisattva stages doesn't come from Shakyamuni Buddha. It doesn't need to. It comes from other Buddhas in visionary experience. So this sutra is telling us not only about the Bodhisattva stages, but about where this idea most likely came from. They're doing it without apology. They're not saying, well, it might not be true because he only saw it in a vision. They're saying, this is authoritative. This is the word of Buddhas, even though it's other Buddhas in other places that he saw. So, to wrap this up and save some time for questions, what does the scripture then say about the Bodhisattva stages? It says that they can be practiced by at least some Buddhists some of the time. It says that they are something that a certain bodhisattva, some guy named Dharmamati, who we don't know anything about, saw in a vision. And it says that the last stages of that path can be described as the attainment of kingship. There are lots of princes. Notice the symbolism here. There may be lots of princes, but only one heir to the throne. They're still remaining with the idea, surprising to East Asianists perhaps, that there can be only one Buddha per world at a time. There can be other Buddhas out there in other galaxies far, far away, but in our world, only one Buddha at a time. So it's a lineage from father to son. It's a lineage from Buddha to the next Buddha. Now, I've spent all this time talking about this Proto Avatamsaka, partly because it's the earliest evidence we have of 10 stages. But those of you who are Buddhist specialists have probably heard a lot more about a text called the Dashabhumika. So I'm going to conclude with a couple of comments on how does that relate. The Dashabhumika author knew the smaller Buddha Avatamsaka and tried to upgrade it. The opening is the same, but on a higher plane. The narrative takes motifs from the Buddha Avatamsaka and expands them, tries to increase them. And it does one extremely important thing that's not in the Buddha Avatamsaka itself. It adds the 6 paramitas. If you read the smaller Buddha Avatamsaka's content, knowing about mainstream Mahayana and the great importance of the 6 paramitas, you'll be struck by the fact that they're not associated with the stages at all. It's in the Dashabhumika that these two things are brought together. So to speak, that this defect in the Buddha Avatamsaka is repaired. There are many other reasons to think that the 10 stages come directly out of the Buddha Avatamsaka and are not formulated first in the Dashabhumika. On your handout, I've given you the name of the translator, Dharmaraksha, who produced the first Chinese version of the Dashabhumika Sutra in the late 3rd or early 4th century. And there's the title of his version of that text. In sum, if we want to find the origins of the 10 stages, we need to set the Dashabhumika aside and look instead at the Proto Buddhavatamsaka to see how these 10 stages were understood. And I think it'll be extremely important in the future to realize their profound connection with meditative and visionary experience, and their profound disconnection with the 6 or later 10 perfections. These seem to represent separate strands, different groups of Mahayanists thinking about what the Bodhisattva path is like. So I'll look forward to hearing what some of you have been thinking about what the Bodhisattva path is like. Thank you very much for your attention.
I think you should stay there, Jan. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. For me it was, and dangerous, as I told you. If there are any questions, maybe.
Do you want to choose? Do you want to designate hands that are up or show?
I don't see any hands that are up.
I see one in the back.
Okay. You will go first. Okay.
2 small questions. 1, do you believe in circles of life? Life after life?
Do I believe? I'm an agnostic. It seems as good an explanation as any other. Agnostic means I don't know. It doesn't mean I'm a disbeliever. It doesn't mean I'm a believer. It seems plausible. I have no personal memories of any previous life.
You have to take a position. One way. I don't believe in that. Absolutely.
Okay.
Nonsense. Absolutely.
Okay.
Total nonsense. Okay, second. Buddha and all this Buddhism. What is the influence of that in daily life? What is the meaning for the people? What way you are different from other people in daily life?
I would say it ranges from 0 for people who are born in a Buddhist family and never do any Buddhist practice, to profoundly important for people who do something Buddhist on a regular basis. That might be meditation, that might be chanting, that might be visiting a temple and paying their respects to an image. It might be making contributions, it might be interacting with a Zen master, all kinds of ways. So it's like any other religion. There are people who actively involve themselves in cultivating their own spiritual development. And there are other people who, often in Japan it's said, many people don't even know what form of Buddhism their family is affiliated with until someone dies and you have to know who to call to arrange the funeral. So there's the same range with Buddhist practitioners today and certainly in the past as with any other religious tradition, I think.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Then.
Thank you. It was very enlightening. I just feel sorry that you couldn't go on and actually compare the 10 stages in the Dashabhumika and so forth in later sources also. With the list that you have here, which would also be very interesting, wouldn't it?
I can do it in about 2 sentences.
Okay.
There's almost no comparison. The Dashabhumika, how many of you, just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever tried to read any amount of the Dashabhumika Sutra in any language, including English, Chinese, Tibetan, anything? Or have glanced at it? Okay. The usual suspects. I'm tempted to say, and now you'll really think I don't believe any of this, I'm tempted to say, don't bother. I would say the text is incoherent. I'd like to hear what you folks think. I know so many people in Buddhist studies who have resolved, Dashabhumika, a great source. I'm going to seriously, sincerely read this. And they get into it and they say, what is this about? The Buddhavatamsaka, the Proto Buddhavatamsaka, has very clear instructions. The Dashabhumika is a kind of effusive, extreme, flowery praise of these stages. In the Dashabhumika, at very low levels, bodhisattvas already have unbelievable accomplishments. They're pure in morality by maybe the second stage or third. They're already having all kinds of special powers at a fairly low level. And the names of the stages also are, I think, more evocative, more flowery than they are descriptive. Starting with pramudita, joyfulness, and ending with dharma megha, dharma cloud. Whereas the ones in the smaller Buddhavatamsaka are very, for the most part, pretty clear what it is they're labeling. So I would suggest that the Dashabhumika author is coming from a later period in which the basic practices are already assumed, but this is a more flowery, what's the word I'm looking for? A kind of paean to the stages, rather than a kind of basic day one instruction manual. Having said that, what do you think?
Well, there's one thing that would seem to be in common, maybe, just the last three stages are also have a special place in the later ideas.
Yes.
That is called them the three pure stages.
Yes.
So that would seem to correspond to your last three here
yes.
in some way.
There is a connection between the two, clearly.
And what I'm really wondering is, where's the stage of seeing here in this list?
Yeah.
Where do you locate it?
It's not a category for them.
Because in the later tradition, the 10 Bhumis start with stage
The Darshana Marga, yeah.
And here it seems to start way before that.
It does.
Just don't know where to locate the stage
right.
of seeing here.
Right. I think what we're seeing here is the whole idea of a stage of seeing is not something that the Proto-Buddhavatamsaka people were working with. They were dealing kind of in isolation with what does the Bodhisattva path itself involve. And the mapping of a Darshana Marga onto 10 stages is the result of a separate move that I believe is not being made in the Buddhavatamsaka, as far as I can tell. Is that unexpected?
No, so clear. Just there's a lot more clarity that could come.
Yeah, there is. One of the things that I didn't have a chance to talk about in detail is evidence within the narrative structure of the Dashabhumika that its author knew the Proto-Buddhavatamsaka. There's a scene in the opening of the Proto-Buddhavatamsaka, just to give you one example. There's a scene in which the Buddha illuminates the worlds in all directions. That's really common. But in the Buddhavatamsaka, what he does is the light comes out of his toe and goes out into the world. Well, that's a good stunt, but it's not really elegant. So they replace that in the Dashabhumika with the light coming from his head, which is much more lovely. And that's an image that's more common than in other sutras. This thing of coming out from his toe, well, you could say that that's really great because feet are the lowest part of the body in India, and if he can do that with his toe, what can he do with his mind and his head? I mean, but it's been changed. There are references to the location, that's been upgraded. So reading from this angle, it looks to me as though the Dashabhumika author was consciously moving on from this early, basic kind of nuts and bolts scenario. But your question, I think, about the Darshana Marga and how these things connect with each other is really important. I should just add briefly that paramitas are linked with the 10 stages in the Dashabhumika, but not thoroughly and effectively there. That was left to the commentators to work out a little more. I hope that at least scratches the surface. Yes, a question here and then over here. Go ahead.
I just wondered about what is about the female which disturbs them to accept that she can be
a Buddha. It reminds me of Can a Woman Be a Priest in the Catholic Church? The 12 disciples were male, therefore. What they say is that there are actually several things that a woman can't become. She can't become Mara, the Buddhist devil. She can't become Brahma, for example, in one of the Buddhist gods. And she can't become a Buddha. There is just a profound assumption that these roles are only appropriate for men. The royal imagery goes with that, but I don't think it thoroughly connects.
Why?
But why? This is a chicken and egg problem, perhaps. But one of the things that very early comes to be applied to Buddhas, but not to Arhats, is not just insight, but a profoundly transformed body. A body that's characterized by what are known as the 32 marks, which I know many of you have read about. Well, many of them are things you see in Buddhist art. There's the long earlobes, the lump on the top of the head, the tuft of hair between the eyebrows, and so on. But one of them is a rather unusual male sexual organ. In other words, it is a penis that is encased, as you have said, or in some sources, retractable. Some of the commentaries say, like a horse. Whatever it is not something that women have. And it's not represented in art because it's described as hidden, appropriately so, given the culture of the day. But it is indisputably male. Now, can women not be Buddhas because they don't have whatever that particular type of male organ is? I doubt it's that simple. But I do think that, putting aside the iconography and what I say chicken and egg, did the 32 marks talk influence what a Buddha could be, or did what a Buddha could be lead to the development of this kind of art? Ultimately, I think we have to say that in this period in India, there was what we, from our great high advanced position, would call a failure of imagination. They simply couldn't imagine a woman as the founder of a religious tradition. And that's what a Buddha by definition is. Someone who goes off into the jungle, meditates by herself, figures it all out for herself, and then teaches it to others, including men. I think it just didn't compute. They had trouble even with how highly ranked can women be within the monastic community. And they were subordinated to the males very early on. So to have a woman as the head of the community, I think just caused some guys a lot of pain. In any case, culturally and socially, they seem not to have been prepared for that. Although in that context, it's remarkable that there was no barrier whatsoever to the idea of women becoming arhats, attaining the highest goal within the early Buddhist monastic community. There are women arhats, there are men arhats, they're mentioned by name. There are a lot more guys, but the women are there. But this notion that women can't become Buddhas is very long-standing. Not 100% universal, but very long-standing. That's the best I can do at trying to explain what these folks might have been thinking.
purely cultural and not ideological?
The fact that it is not really tied to Buddhist doctrine, I think, is shown by the fact that some Buddhists later in East Asia and in Tibet, in very late India and Tantric practice, were able to talk of female Buddhas in some cases. So there's no doctrine that prevents it. There is a convention, a social convention that prevents it. I think that's probably the best way to put it. So,
Okay. What?
yes.
This topic, personally, thank you, because I think every word you said was enlightening and relevant to the work I'm doing. I'm working on a text called Shravaka Bhumi, so just the name relevant and it's very much present.
Can you guys hear in the back what he's saying?
I'll try.
Okay. Why don't you yell, and if they can't hear you, I'll repeat what you said. He's working on a text called the Shravaka Bhumi, so go ahead.
And Yeah, I wanted to ask, maybe I'll ask two questions, try to limit asking. One of the things, I think I missed, probably my attention, but I missed something at the bottom line. You said this has to come from, the 10 stages come from the vision of Dharmamati, and you see it relevant to society where kingdoms or so where do you think where is it? Is it North India? When?
Okay.
Where? And would it be fair to say that it's not enough to have somebody having a vision, but we would also think that there is a need for such a theory to be there, otherwise the vision would get lost.
Yeah.
It falls into the right place. So do you see this need there?
Okay. Let me repeat briefly the question. First of all, where does this vision story come from? The idea of 10 Bhumis. It can be located in India in a particular time or place. And secondly, why did anybody believe this account? And why did they preserve it? Did it answer some particular need? Or why was it not simply forgotten or even denied? You didn't say that, but that would be another possibility. Is that a fair representation? Okay. Alas, we do not know where this came from in India. The smaller Buddhavatamsaka, this Proto Buddhavatamsaka that we have these early Chinese translations of, doesn't exist in Sanskrit or in any other Indian language so far. They're still digging. Maybe they'll come up with a manuscript. But at this time, we don't have an Indian version. So to try to figure out where it came from, all we can do is look at the way the Chinese translated it. Sometimes we can infer things from the transcribed terms, where they don't translate a name, but they try to represent the sounds by using Chinese characters. Very cumbersome, very difficult. Can we tell from those transcriptions what the Indian language or dialect was, and then tell where that was? There is some evidence for Gandhari. That evidence tallies in a very interesting way with Manjushri's prominence in some texts that are thought to come from the Northwest. I think we can say this text came out of a community that venerated the Bodhisattva Manjushri. Then we have to stand back and say, who was that? And where was that? But by using language and cultic references together, it seems plausible that the text came from the northwestern border regions of India. But that's only, let me emphasize, only not even a working hypothesis. It's a possibility. Second part, why did people buy this? Why did they believe and preserve this account? We have a lot of evidence in other early Mahayana sutras that I didn't talk about, that Mahayana Buddhists treasured visions. In fact, the whole idea that there are other worlds out there, other universes like our own, seems to appear in India first, not in Hinduism, which you'd kind of expect. They do all kinds of other spectacular things. But this seems to appear first in Buddhist literature, and exclusively at the beginning in Mahayana Buddhist literature. Why? The idea, I think, that there might be other worlds out there to see in a vision answers a very difficult problem for Mahayana Buddhists, that is, for Bodhisattvas. We could, again, use the PhD candidate analogy. When you finish your degree, where are you going to get a job? Maitreya is the next Buddha in this world system. The amount of time between Shakyamuni's death and Maitreya's time is usually said to be 5.6 billion years. Okay, well, you're a bodhisattva. How far back in the queue are you behind Maitreya? It's like you're in an ice cream shop. Please take a number and wait. That's a long wait. But if there are other universes out there, you might be able to get a job sooner. But there's something else you need to become a Buddha. And I didn't talk about this today. What happens? What makes you irreversible? Is there a defining moment, a defining experience that changes you from somebody who could give up and go away and become a Shravaka, changes you into someone who is bound for the goal. Bodhisattva for life until you become a Buddha. There is. In these early texts, that moment is receiving a prediction from a living, breathing, teaching Buddha. Shakyamuni, however, is dead. Where are you going to get your prediction? This is a huge issue in some of the early Mahayana sutras. The Ashtasahasrika is a particularly rich place to look for that discussion. And so, I think we can see this kind of vision of there being other worlds even existing, first of all, as an answer to what I could call, somewhat facetiously, Bodhisattva job market crowding, too many applicants for one job, and job only in the distant future. And it also offers a solution to the problem of where are you going to get your prediction? Where can you find a living Buddha? Some of these predictions seem to have come in visions. So, be that as it may, there are lots of references to visionary experience in early Mahayana scriptures, and it's clear that these were taken seriously as sources of authority. Not only Shakyamuni, but other Buddhas as well. So I think we can say by the time of this Dharmamati experience, and I tend to take it as a historical account, vision was accepted as legitimate. The existence of other Buddhas in all the 10 directions was accepted as real. And whoever Dharmamati was, he must have had a good reputation. Or his monastic fellows would probably not have paid a whole lot of attention to his story.
Is this repeated in the Dashakamika as far as the origin?
No, it's not.
And it doesn't say anything about it.
No. It may have become a problem later. Actually, you often find that where the earliest version of a scripture says, this is the sermon or the lecture of monk so-and-so, if you can find a later version of that same scripture, monk so-and-so has disappeared. Now it's the word of the Buddha. And that, in fact, is what we find in the Dashabhumika, that this is being attributed to inspiration of the Buddha, not to simply Dharmamati's own dream. So, it's an interesting development.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
It's not a small question, but I would like to hear your opinion about where can you locate the transition from the idea that only a Buddha can teach Arhats, now there is no Buddha, to the idea that there are many Buddhas.
So the transition between the idea that only a Buddha can teach Arhats.
But there is no Buddha at the moment to teach.
Okay.
To the idea that there are many Buddhas.
Well, there's certainly an intermediate step, which is, you can see even today in Sri Lanka and Thailand, for example, where their worldview is not basically Mahayana. Can someone become an Arhat in Thailand today? The usual answer is yes. That if they're practicing within a Buddhist tradition, in other words, it's not simply whether the Buddha is dead or alive, it's whether Buddhism is dead or alive. If there's a memory of Buddhism and how to practice, and a community to practice in, then a person today can become an Arhat. And it's occasionally said in Thailand that so-and-so, usually monks who lived out in the jungle, very isolated, meditating monks, that so-and-so was or is an Arhat. In Sri Lanka, they're much more skeptical. They tend to say, nah, can't do it anymore. Too long since the time of the Buddha. Come back next time in the time of Maitreya. So for the Arhats themselves, the tradition, as you know, of course, is that it gets harder and harder and harder the more time passes from Shakyamuni's death. But up to a certain point or down to a certain point, it's still possible. But for Arhats, it's not essential to have a living Buddha, and it's not essential to get a prediction at all. Arhatship can be attained without either of those. But the story of the prediction of a bodhisattva, the idea that that determines when you're sort of home free, when you become irreversible, I think was a key contributing factor in eliciting or making necessary the idea of other Buddhas. And where do we look for that? I think we look to the Dipankara story, with the prototypical story of the ancient Buddha Dipankara, eons and eons ago, giving a prediction of future Buddhahood to the young man who, in long lifetimes after, would finally become Shakyamuni. This is a famous Jataka tale. It's a regional Jataka tale that appears to be from Gandhara, that is the far northwest of the Indian cultural area at the time. So it's not one of the oldest. It's not in the 547 Pali Jatakas. It's in the Nidanakata, the preface. So we can see that it's not part of that core oldest tradition, but once it gets in there, it becomes extraordinarily popular. And by extension, then, I think Mahayana Buddhist Bodhisattva practitioners said, well, this happened to Shakyamuni. So to become what he became, I have to get a prediction too. Where and how will I do that? I have to meet a living Buddha. I have to say to him, I want to become like you. I resolve to become a Buddha in the future. And then that Buddha says, you, young man, will become a Buddha by the name of such and such. In a few later sutras, it's you, young lady. But the understanding is that she becomes male because all the Buddha names have masculine endings in Sanskrit. So, but does that really get at what you're asking, or is there something else, another issue there that you wanted?
Well, I was actually aiming for the Chinese sources, which I'm unable to read, and what they can offer on this question.
So of the transition from just the idea of just one Buddha to the idea of many Buddhas?
Yeah.
Specifically. Okay. Bracketing on Shugao, who doesn't help us because these non-Buddhist texts aren't referring to Buddhas throughout the universe, and starting with Lokakshema and Anchuan and so on. The very earliest Mahayana translations into Chinese assume other Buddhas and other worlds. They may not talk about them a lot. Some sutras do, some sutras don't. But in the Ashta Sahasrika, for example, as you know, of course, Akshobhya plays a big role. And his world, this is a Buddha like the very popular Buddha Amida in Japanese, or Amitabha, Amitofo in Chinese, who has a paradise-like land in the west. Akshobhya was a Buddha figure who had a paradise-like land in the east, billions of miles from our universe, another world system, as they say. So already at the time that the Perfection of Wisdom was translated, around the year 180, there was an idea of Akshobhya's world, specifically, particular Buddha, particular name, particular direction, and that people could be reborn there. And they could get their predictions, by the way, from Akshobhya. By the time the Pratyutpanna Buddha Samukha Avastita Samadhi Sutra, again, a good reason not to study Sanskrit, titles like that, was translated. This is the Bancho Sanmei Jing. What is it? Hanzu Sanmai Kyo in Japanese? I can do it. Close. Anyway. Taisho 418. I like to do it by the numbers. By the time that was translated by the same person, around the same date, 180 or so, there was evidence in that sutra of belief in Amitabha and his world, but also a mention of Buddhas throughout the 10 directions. So we know it had happened in India by the time these sutras were coming into China. What's unfortunate is we don't have earlier sutras that reflect a formative period of this idea. But I strongly suspect, as with many other key Mahayana notions, like the notion that you can become a bodhisattva at all, that this first developed off camera. That is, it developed in conversation among people who were practicing the bodhisattva path and discussing with each other or reflecting to themselves in meditation. What about this? What about that? How and when do I get my prediction? Where will I become a Buddha? Is it only here? And I think it's worth noting that in non-Mahayana scriptures, there's some evidence of resistance or objection to the idea of other worlds out there. Especially, they object to other worlds above and below. And the Buddhist texts always talk about 10 directions. Okay, 4 directions, north, south, east, west. 4 more are the intermediate. northeast, southeast, and so on. And then the zenith and the nadir, up and down, that's 10. So does that mean there are hells at the bottom of our world? Does that mean that their heavens are below our hells? Some of the commentators really objected to this. You can go dig around in the Chinese translation of the Mahavibhasha if you want arguments against this silly idea of systems throughout the 10 directions. It's not coming from those circles, that's for sure. It's coming from somewhere else. And as far as I can see, all of the evidence is that the notion of universes like our own came out in Mahayana circles first, and then spread to some degree to other types of Buddhists. But it's not coming from the Jains, it's not coming from the Hindus, not coming from the Ajivikas, none of those guys. It was the Mahayana practitioners, I think, who needed it as a solution. At least that's my theory at this point.
Okay. I have about 5,000 questions. I'll try to kind of put them into one. First of all, thanks, and also for your book, and I think you really answered many questions. Also now, I'm kind of putting things together, what you answered to Boaz, but there's still maybe something else to ask. I'm very interested in the idea of the vision. And Paul Harrison has spoken of that too, and you don't speak about that in your book either, which is also a really different tradition. So Dharma Mati had this vision maybe of the Buddha, the light coming out of the Buddha's foot, right, or something like that. And then, well, whatever, however it elaborated. His students, are they trying to reproduce the vision? Are they working with visions themselves? Are they just like studying it like Dharma class or something like that? Okay, that's one question. And another one would be, you haven't said much about compassion.
Right.
I'm actually kind of, I'm not that sure about the Jataka origin, at least not as the soul origin, certainly because it's a little too popular for what we want Mahayana. I mean, I don't know, not what we want, or you maybe become used to saying what the Mahayana origins are about. And I wonder where that comes from in the vow and right, Bodhisattva Bhumis or whatever.
It's an interesting cluster of questions. Let me start with compassion. I didn't say even the word, I think. I did talk about how a few people, at least, are needed to make it possible for others in the future to become arhats, first of all. And that is explicitly, or implicitly rather, an act of compassion to choose this role which will allow you to become a Buddha. Words for compassion do occur in the Proto Avatamsaka. There's a section in the discussion of the practices about the various things that a bodhisattva will be able to do for others. So it's not by any means neglected there. What I find interesting is that in most of the arguably early Mahayana sutras that I've looked at, the virtue of Maitri, that is a kind of horizontal, person-to-person, loving kindness, is the one that's really featured. They talk about Maha Maitri as one of the characteristics of the Bodhisattva. In a number of these sutras, and the Ugra Parivraccha is one, Karuna tends to mean pity. Looking down at somebody, oh, what a shame. It's used when someone really screws up in their religious practice or violates the ethical precepts, then you have karuna, compassion for them. Whereas Maitri is equal all around. I think of it as a horizontal emotion, whereas the compassion is a downward looking. And mudita then becomes upward looking when somebody gets the scholarship that you didn't get. And you rejoice with them anyway. That's mudita, rejoicing in their good fortune. So it's there. But you might say that the idea that Buddhahood is something you want to accomplish, in order to do good for others, is as automatic, as implicit as becoming a doctor is because you want to help people. But the issue is, how do you get into medical school? What are the requirements? How do you survive the long hours? All the specifics that still have to be worked out. So it may well be that the notion of compassion, or at least of Maitri, loving kindness, is there always in the background. but is not explicitly articulated all the time because there are other urgent problems that need to be solved as to how you get to the point where you can then exercise that compassion. I'm not sure that got at everything you were looking for, though.
The problem, still, where does it come from? I mean, why does it become so prominent?
Compassion.
Yeah, and because also in the Ugra, one thing you didn't say, what you spoke of in your book, is that it's something you do between you and yourself. You're imagining it's like a way to kind of enhance your own spiritual powers, right? And not so much this mantra you're speaking of, you know. The karana in the Ugra, as you spoke of it, if I understood you, is something that has nothing to do with others.
You're probably thinking of, for example, in Shantideva, where he talks about giving as something that you mentally do. And you think, hey, aren't you supposed to be helping people? And instead, the Bodhisattva is out in the forest, all by himself, meditating on giving. What a good idea. Is anyone benefiting? And our authors, this is discussed in detail in the Dajji Dulun, or the Daichi Doron in Japanese, the great treatise on perfection of wisdom translated by Kumarajiva. And they are having to defend the poor Bodhisattva, because people are criticizing Bodhisattva, saying, you guys say you're compassionate, you're just sitting out in the woods meditating. So what gives? And the answer is, they are preparing for something so great that it's worth being isolated and cultivating themselves now so that they can give this huge contribution in the future. And I think your analogy, this is sort of from the book, so I may be repeating myself for somebody like you who's already read it, but the analogy with a medical student really works well. Do you want to be operated on by a first-year medical student or by someone who now has their MD degree? Should he be compassionate to your body now or later? Get the knowledge, get the degree, then use your compassion to help others. And that's one of the things I see going on in these texts. The whole choice to embark on this path is an act of compassion. Partly because reading those Jataka stories, whatever the chronology relationship, reading those stories you can see there are going to be a lot of lives, and some of them are not going to be fun. And that rabbit that throws himself into the fire to be eaten as dinner by someone. Or the story that's not in the Pali, but very popular elsewhere, of the young prince who throws himself to feed a hungry tigress. I'm sure many of you know this very dramatic story. If you read Shantideva carefully, this is 8th century, so later stuff, there were bodhisattvas worrying about this. They were thinking, he says, I may have to sacrifice a hand or a foot or something. Shantideva's reply, start with vegetables. Worry about the hand and the foot or the whole body to the tigress. Worry about that later. But it's in the script. And once bodhisattvas start using this Jataka material as a manual, how to become a Buddha, are you supposed to skip one of the stories because it's a little bit difficult? They seem not to have thought so. They seem to have been taking this as a real list of things you've got to do, that all Buddhas pass through these same experiences. So to even think, I'm willing to become the sort of person who will throw myself to a tigress someday, vegetables for now, but someday, that's something that's not difficult to read as an act of compassion. I'm so willing to help others in the future when I become a Buddha that I'll even go through this. There is, of course, also the undercurrent of, and boy will I be great then. And they tell you to think about that. I'm going to have all those glorious 32 marks. Wow. That's in there. But the compassion, I think, is also woven into the text and not always out front. And the visions come and go. There are real non-visionary texts. I sometimes call them sort of flat-footed. Like, this world is enough, just do with this, future lives, past lives, that's enough. And I think the Ugra is basically in that camp, with the small exception of the Triskandika material, where the practitioner is visualizing Buddhas and performing repentance. But it doesn't talk about visions much. The Ashta is kind of in between. The Buddha allows people to see Akshobhya's world, but it's the Buddha who's making that vision accessible to the entire audience. It's not that people individually are off cultivating samadhi. But then toward the end of the sutra, all of a sudden you get the Siddhaparudita story. And that's vision big time. Samadhi on every page. It's certainly different. I think, it's fair to say that it was grafted onto a pre-existing Ashta text in some form. So it's breathing different air. It's a different type of literature. So samadhi is certainly not, in this sense, samadhi, visionary experience, is not universal in these texts. It was obviously much more important to some groups at some times than to others in other times. And there's a history to be written about that. I think Paul Harrison has performed a real service in, this is a scholar from New Zealand who now teaches at Stanford in California in the United States, has performed a real service in drawing attention to the importance of vision as one of the ingredients in leading to the composition of Mahayana sutras and shaping notions of the Mahayana path in very unique ways. But there were other strands too. There's a lot going on. This is a very motley crew of Bodhisattva practitioners with lots of different ideas and lots of different practices.
There's another question?
Okay, I guess it is related to Aviatar's compassion in some ways, but it didn't initiate in Aviatar's question, but in your example, which I liked a lot of the MA and PhD students, I enjoyed your whole lecture, but this, I think that by means of this example, you brought in very beautifully the old Buddhist perspective. Mm-hmm. And then I came back to my, so to speak, Chinese perspective, mm-hmm. and now I'm the Chinese professor mm-hmm. who thinks about these students, mm-hmm. and I realized that there might be also a qualitative difference mm-hmm. Between the MA and PhD. Mm-hmm. And in the analogy, it comes back to compassion. Mm-hmm. In a way, being an Arhat is only, quote unquote, a metaphysical achievement. Mm-hmm. It is not, where is this world? Mm-hmm. Where is moral life? It lacks the whole moral dimension. Mm-hmm. It lacks this worldly perspective. It lacks compassion. It lacks mm-hmm. human, and this is why this disappointment from the possibility of falling in the last stage. Mm-hmm. Again, at least from a Chinese perspective, mm-hmm. it's not only a matter of quantity. Mm-hmm. There is some inherent difference of quality between this MA and PhD after all.
Yeah, it's just not just more difficult versions of the same thing. There's some new ingredients, clearly. One thing that I'd like to just toss out in terms of the Chinese side of things is how profoundly and early Chinese Buddhists were influenced by Mahayana scriptures. Yeah. Obviously, the texts did not come into China in the same sequence in which they were composed in India. In fact, in many respects, it was backwards. They translated a few non-Mahayana scriptures first, and then a wave of Mahayana texts, and later they sort of went back and said, oh, we forgot to get the agamas, the sections of non-Mahayana sutras. Oh, we forgot to get the Vinaya. Let's get that. And this is happening centuries later. So the whole way in which the Chinese apprehension of, reception of Buddhism was shaped was framed in a fascinating way by Mahayana assumptions, and above all by a text I didn't even talk about today, the Lotus Sutra. I think it provided a key hermeneutical lens, a means of understanding all the other scriptures that was greatly used by exegetes there. As far as the Arhat and what they lack, certainly there are plenty of Mahayana scriptures that criticize Arhats for not being compassionate. And there is a whole series of types of Mahayana, ranging from the notion, the real three vehicles that, different strokes for different folks, depends on your temperament, all of them are good. Become an Arhat, become a Buddha, maybe become a Predicate Buddha. These are all good. We need all of them. To people who say, those Arhats, they're really lazy, they're really selfish. It's possible to become an Arhat, but that's a bad thing. And that's a kind of Bodhisattva universalism, which means everybody should do that. But it's a weak kind. The strong kind you see in the Lotus, which says, those Arhats think they're Arhats. but they're really not awakened. Everybody's on the path to Buddhahood, know it or not. So there are all these different stances in the texts. For traditions, though, such as the living Theravada tradition in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, that take the Arhat path very seriously. I mean, there are a few bodhisattvas there within that tradition, but the Arhat model is paramount. They would say that morality is very much there because the only way you can successfully become an Arhat is to fulfill the purification of your own morality. And that involves how you relate to other people. Within the monastery, outside the monastery, whether begging for food simply as a way for people to make merit, or whether as a teacher for lay people. So there, in fact, if we get outside those Mahayana scriptures that are criticizing, I would say, a kind of straw man Arhat, kind of made up Arhat, to say, oh, this guy's selfish. If you talk about people who have interacted with real humans who are thought to be Arhats, or thought to be very close to Arhatship, what you hear is this person is tremendously compassionate. He took the time to teach. He interacts with people by teaching them simply by his presence, a kind of darshan, to use the more frequently Hindu term. So there is, I think, a much overlooked social component to Arhatship and the progress toward Arhatship than one would think from reading some of the Mahayana scriptures that rant and rave. But those Mahayana scriptures were extremely important in China and elsewhere in East Asia. So I think that also should not be overlooked. The Chinese case is a fascinating, different window on how to be a Buddhist. So thank you for bringing that up.
John, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we ran out of time and there's no more time for other questions. So probably you can catch her on the way to lunch.
Don't catch me on the restroom.
Maybe, if there will be many requests, maybe tomorrow we can continue it. And thank you very much for fascinating.
Thank you for all the great questions.